The sun had barely risen on that cold, gray morning 5 years ago, when Michael Thompson's life changed forever. It was the kind of day where everything felt off, like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. For Michael, it started with a phone call in the middle of the night. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence of his home, jolting him awake from a restless sleep. His heart sank even before he picked up the receiver because deep down, he already knew something was wrong. On the other end of the line was a police officer, his voice calm but firm as he delivered the news that would haunt Michael for years to come. Ethan, Michael's only son, had been involved in a car accident. At first, Michael clung to hope, thinking maybe it wasn't serious. Maybe Ethan had just gotten into a minor fender bender or skidded off the road due to bad weather. But then, the officer said the words Michael dreaded most. "I'm sorry, sir, but your son didn't make it." Time seemed to stop. Michael dropped the phone, his knees buckling beneath him as the weight of those words hit him like a freight train. Sarah, his wife, rushed into the room, her face pale with worry after hearing his strangled cry. When she saw the look on his face, she didn't need him to say anything. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably as they held each other, their grief merging into one overwhelming wave of pain. Ethan had been more than just their son. He was the center of their world. From the moment he was born, he brought light and laughter into their lives. As a child, he was full of curiosity, always asking questions about how things worked or why the sky was blue. He grew up to be smart, kind, and ambitious, excelling in school and earning a scholarship to study architecture at a prestigious university. Everyone who met Ethan couldn't help but be drawn to his infectious enthusiasm and warm smile. He dreamed of designing buildings that would inspire people, leaving a lasting mark on the world. But now all those dreams were gone, snuffed out in an instant by a reckless decision made in anger. Earlier that evening, Michael and Ethan had argued over something trivial, a missed family dinner. Ethan had promised to come home for a meal together, but instead he stayed late at the library working on a project. When Michael called to remind him, frustration bubbled over and harsh words were exchanged. Ethan stormed out of the house, vowing not to return until later. Neither of them could have imagined that this petty disagreement would be their final conversation. As details of the accident emerged, the guilt began to eat away at Michael. It turned out that Ethan, upset and distracted, had driven recklessly through the pouring rain. His car hydroplaned on a wet patch of road, spinning out of control before crashing into a tree. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was too late. They said Ethan died instantly, sparing him any pain. But that knowledge offered little comfort to Michael. In his mind, he replayed the argument over and over again, torturing himself with thoughts of what he could have done differently. If only he hadn't pushed Ethan so hard. If only he'd let the missed dinner slide. If only. The days following Ethan's death passed in a blur of tears, condolences, and hollow rituals. Friends and family gathered to support Michael and Sarah, but no amount of sympathy could fill the void left behind. The funeral was a somber affair, filled with heartfelt eulogies and tearful farewells. As they lowered Ethan's casket into the ground, Michael felt as though a piece of himself was being buried alongside his son. Every shovel of dirt thrown onto the grave felt heavier than the last, weighing him down with an unbearable sense of loss. In the months that followed, life became a series of empty routines. Michael went through the motions of work and daily chores, but nothing felt real anymore. At night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of Ethan's laughter and the sound of his voice. Sometimes he would walk into Ethan's old room, sitting on the edge of the bed just to feel closer to him. The air smelled faintly of cologne, a lingering reminder of the boy who used to live there. Other times, he found himself driving past places they used to visit together: the park where they played catch, the diner where they shared milkshakes, the bookstore where Ethan spent hours browsing shelves. Each location triggered a flood of bittersweet memories, making the pain fresh all over again. Sarah tried her best to hold the family together, but even she struggled under the weight of her own sorrow. She encouraged Michael to talk about his feelings, hoping it would help him heal, but he couldn't bring himself to open up. Instead, he bottled everything inside, letting the guilt and grief consume him bit by bit. Their once vibrant marriage grew strained, with long silences replacing the easy conversations they used to share. Still, they leaned on each other during the darkest moments, finding solace in the fact that they weren't alone in their suffering. Despite the passage of time, the wound of losing Ethan never fully healed. Anniversaries came and went, marked by quiet visits to the cemetery where they placed flowers on his grave. On some days, Michael found himself talking to Ethan as if he were still there, sharing stories about work or reminiscing about old times. He often wondered what Ethan's life might have looked like if fate had taken a different turn. Would he have become the brilliant architect he always dreamed of? Would he have fallen in love, started a family of his own? These unanswered questions lingered in the back of Michael's mind, fueling his endless cycle of what-ifs. Though 5 years had passed since that fateful night, the ache of losing Ethan remained as raw as ever. Michael carried the burden of his son's death like a shadow, unable to escape the crushing weight of regret. Little did he know, however, that the story of Ethan's life and death was far from over. What awaited him in the future would challenge everything he thought he knew, forcing him to confront not only his grief but also the mysteries of life, death, and perhaps even something greater beyond. The guilt that had taken root in Michael's heart after Ethan's death grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a constant, suffocating presence that followed him everywhere he went. At work, during meals, even in the quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him like an invisible hand. He couldn't shake the belief that he was responsible for Ethan's accident, that if he had handled things differently, his son might still be alive. Michael replayed the argument in his mind countless times, dissecting every word and tone, searching for some way to undo what had been done. That night, Ethan had seemed so angry, angrier than Michael had ever seen him. They had fought before, of course, but never like this. It was supposed to be about something small, something trivial. Dinner. Just dinner. Michael had planned it, as a way to reconnect, to spend quality time together as a family. But when Ethan didn't show up, frustration got the better way of him. Over the phone, Michael's voice had risen, sharp and accusing. "You always do this," he'd said, bitterly. "You don't care about anyone but yourself." Even now, years later, those words echoed in his ears, cutting deeper with each repetition. What kind of father says something like that to his own child? Michael wondered. He remembered the hurt in Ethan's eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house without another word. Michael hadn't gone after him. He hadn't tried to stop him or apologize. He'd simply stood there, fuming, letting pride get in the way of reason. And then came the call, from the police. The call that shattered everything. Every detail of that night haunted him. The rain-soaked roads, the sound of screeching tires, the image of Ethan's car crumpled against a tree. Michael imagined it all vividly, torturing himself with scenes he hadn't witnessed but couldn't escape. Sometimes late at night, he would sit alone in the living room with a glass of whiskey, staring blankly at the wall as his mind conjured up endless variations of how things could have ended differently. If only he'd kept his temper in check. If only he'd hugged Ethan instead of yelling at him. If only. Sarah often tried to reassure him, telling him it wasn't his fault, that Ethan's choices were his own. "You can't blame yourself for something you couldn't control," she would say gently, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. But her words offered little relief. To Michael, they felt hollow, like platitudes meant to ease the pain rather than address the truth. Deep down, he believed he could have controlled it, that he should have known better, acted better, loved better. The fact that Ethan was gone while he remained left him feeling unworthy, as though fate had made a mistake by sparing him. This gnawing sense of guilt seeped into every aspect of Michael's life, shaping his thoughts and actions in ways he barely noticed. At work, he became withdrawn, avoiding conversations with colleagues and burying himself in tasks to distract from the storm brewing inside him. At home, he distanced himself emotionally, retreating into silence whenever Sarah tried to engage him. She noticed, of course. How could she not? But she didn't push too hard. She understood grief well enough to know that forcing someone to talk rarely helped. Still, she worried about him. She saw how much he was suffering and wished there was something she could do to ease his burden. For Michael, sleep became elusive. Nightmares plagued him regularly, visions of Ethan calling out to him from beyond the grave. In these dreams, Ethan's voice was soft but accusatory. "Why didn't you stop me, Dad?" he would ask, his face pale and ghostly. "Why didn't you save me?" Michael would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that Ethan was somehow still nearby, watching, waiting. Even during waking hours, he sometimes felt a strange presence around him, as though Ethan's spirit lingered in the corners of their home, silently observing. To cope, or perhaps to avoid confronting his emotions, Michael threw himself into practical tasks. He cleaned out Ethan's room meticulously, folding clothes and organizing books as if preparing for his son's return. He visited the cemetery almost daily, sitting by the gravestone for hours as though hoping to catch a glimpse of Ethan walking toward him. On weekends, he drove aimlessly through town, stopping at places they used to frequent. The park where Ethan played soccer as a kid, the cafe where he studied for exams, the movie theater where they watched superhero films together. Each location brought back memories, both happy and painful, but none offered the closure he so desperately sought. Despite his efforts to stay busy, Michael found himself spiraling further into despair. He stopped shaving, let his hair grow unkempt, and wore the same tired expression day after day. Friends and coworkers began to notice, offering condolences and asking if he was okay. He nodded politely, assuring them he was fine, but inside, he felt anything but. How could he explain the depth of his anguish to people who hadn't experienced such loss? How could he put into words the crushing weight of knowing that his last interaction with Ethan had been filled with anger and regret? One particularly difficult evening, Michael sat alone in the garage, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects. He stared at an old wooden box Ethan had once built during summer camp, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. Inside, it contained trinkets and mementos from Ethan's childhood, ticket stubs from school plays, ribbons from track meets, a faded photograph of the two of them fishing by the lake. Michael opened the box slowly, running his fingers over each item as tears streamed down his face. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to cry openly, releasing the pent-up sorrow he had been carrying for so long. As the weeks turned into months, Michael began to wonder if he would ever find peace. Was it possible to forgive himself for something that felt unforgivable? Could he learn to live with the knowledge that his actions, or inactions, had contributed to his son's untimely death? These questions swirled endlessly in his mind, leaving him exhausted and overwhelmed. Yet, amid the darkness, a tiny flicker of hope remained. Somewhere deep within him, buried beneath layers of guilt and grief, was the belief that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to make things right. He didn't know how or when, but he clung to that hope like a lifeline, praying that someday he would find the answers he so desperately needed. It was a quiet, unremarkable night when Michael first had the dream. He had gone to bed early, exhausted from another long day of trying and failing to outrun his grief. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the floorboards as they settled. Sarah had already fallen asleep beside him, her breathing steady and rhythmic, but Michael's mind refused to rest. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging him into its depths like an unwilling swimmer pulled under by a current. At first, the dream felt ordinary, almost mundane. Michael found himself standing in the cemetery where Ethan was buried. The sky above was overcast, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of freshly turned soil. It wasn't unusual for Michael to dream about visiting Ethan's grave. He did it often enough in real life that his subconscious likely recreated the scene without much effort, but something about this particular dream felt different. more vivid, more real than any he'd experienced before. As Michael walked along the rows of headstones, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path, he noticed a figure standing near Ethan's grave. At first it was just a shadowy outline, indistinct and blurry, but as he drew closer the figure became clearer until there was no mistaking who it was. It was Ethan, his son, standing there as if nothing had changed, dressed in the same clothes he'd worn on the last day of his life. Michael froze, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it echoing in his ears. For a moment, he thought he might be hallucinating, or perhaps this was some cruel trick played by his guilt-ridden mind. But Ethan looked so alive, so solid, that Michael couldn't dismiss the vision outright. There was no mistaking the familiar curve of his smile, or the way his hair fell slightly over his forehead. Even the slight dimple in his left cheek, a trait Michael had teased him about since childhood, was perfectly intact. "Dad," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that sent chills down Michael's spine. "You need to open my coffin." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He stared at Ethan, unable to speak, his mouth dry and his throat tight. Open the coffin? The very idea seemed absurd, even in the context of a dream. Coffins weren't meant to be opened, not after 5 years underground. Yet Ethan's tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, as though he were simply reminding Michael to pick up milk from the store. "I don't understand," Michael finally managed to stammer, his voice trembling. "Why would I do that? You're here." Ethan shook his head gently, his expression unreadable. "It's important, Dad. Trust me." Before Michael could respond, the dream began to shift. The cemetery faded away, replaced by darkness. He called out to Ethan, desperate to keep him in sight. But his son's form dissolved into the void until all that remained was silence. Then abruptly, Michael woke up, gasping for air as though he'd been underwater. For several minutes, he lay there in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what he'd just experienced. Was it really a dream? Or had it been something else entirely? The memory of Ethan's face lingered in his mind, sharp and clear, refusing to fade like most dreams did upon waking. And those words, "You need to open my coffin," reverberated through his thoughts, impossible to ignore. Michael glanced at Sarah sleeping peacefully beside him and debated whether to wake her. Should he tell her about the dream? Would she think he was losing his grip on reality? After a moment's hesitation, he decided against it. Instead, he slipped out of bed and padded quietly into the living room, where he sat in the dark, replaying the dream over and over in his head. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the dream held significance. Maybe it was just his subconscious manifesting his guilt, urging him to confront his unresolved feelings about Ethan's death. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more. What if Ethan's spirit truly was reaching out to him, trying to communicate? From beyond the grave? Michael didn't consider himself a particularly spiritual person, but the intensity of the dream made it hard to dismiss outright. Over the next few days, the image of Ethan standing by his gravestone haunted Michael wherever he went. He couldn't focus at work, couldn't concentrate on conversations with friends or colleagues. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face, heard his voice saying, "Open my coffin." The phrase became a mantra in Michael's mind, repeating itself endlessly until it consumed every other thought. He tried to distract himself by keeping busy. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, organized Ethan's old belongings, and even started working on a puzzle Sarah had bought months ago but never touched. But no matter how hard he worked, the dream refused to leave him alone. It followed him like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. Michael began researching what happens to a body after 5 years in a coffin. He scoured articles online, reading about decomposition rates, embalming techniques, and environmental factors that might affect preservation. Most sources confirmed what he already knew. After such a long period, there wouldn't be much left of Ethan's remains. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the dream was pointing him toward something specific. something tangible. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table flipping through an old photo album, Michael found himself staring at a picture of Ethan taken shortly before the accident. In the photo, Ethan stood grinning broadly, his arms wrapped around two of his college friends. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and his posture radiated confidence. Looking at the image now, Michael felt a pang of longing so intense it brought tears to his eyes. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered aloud as if Ethan could somehow hear him. "What am I supposed to find?" The question hung in the air unanswered. But deep down, Michael felt certain that the only way to move forward was to act on the dream. Whether it was madness or divine intervention, he didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore it any longer. If opening the coffin meant finding closure or even just understanding why the dream had come to him, then he owed it to Ethan to follow through. With that decision, a strange sense of calm washed over Michael. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose, however irrational it might seem. He didn't know what awaited him at the cemetery, but he was determined to face it head-on. Whatever secrets lay buried beneath the ground, he was ready to uncover them, even if it meant confronting the unimaginable. Michael's decision to open Ethan's coffin didn't come easily. It weighed on him like a second shadow, lingering in the corners of his mind as he wrestled with doubt and fear. On one hand, the dream had felt so vivid, so real, that ignoring it seemed impossible. But on the other hand, the practicalities of exhuming a body after 5 years were daunting and legally complicated. The thought of disturbing Ethan's final resting place filled Michael with unease. Was he being selfish? Crazy? Or was there truly something more at play? The first step was contacting the cemetery director, a task Michael approached with trepidation. He sat at his kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at the phone, rehearsing what he would say. How do you explain to someone that you want to dig up your son's grave because of a dream? Finally, summoning all the courage he could muster, he dialed the number. "Hello, this is Mr. Thompson," he began hesitantly when the director answered. I need to speak with you about my son's burial plot." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. What can I assist you with?" Michael took a deep breath. "It's about Ethan. I'd like to arrange for the exhumation of his remains." The silence that followed stretched longer than Michael expected. When the director finally spoke, his tone was cautious but professional. "Exhumations are serious matters, Mr. Thompson. May I ask why you're requesting this?" Michael hesitated again. He couldn't very well admit that he'd dreamed his dead son told him to open the coffin. It sounded absurd even to him. Instead, he settled on a vague explanation. "I have personal reasons. It's something I feel I need to do." Thankfully, the director didn't press further. He explained the legal process involved: obtaining permission from local authorities, filing paperwork, and scheduling the exhumation itself. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but it was possible. As they wrapped up the call, Michael felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the director hadn't dismissed him outright, and dread at the enormity of what he was about to undertake. When Sarah found out, she was furious. "Are you out of your mind?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. They were sitting in the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, but the warmth did little to ease the tension between them. "You want to dig up our son's grave because of some dream? Michael, this isn't healthy." "I know how it sounds," Michael replied quietly, avoiding her gaze. "But I can't ignore it, Sarah. This dream, it felt different. Like Ethan was trying to tell me something." Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You're torturing yourself. Ethan is gone, Michael. Nothing is going to bring him back. Not dreams, not opening coffins, nothing. Let him rest in peace." Her words stung, but Michael refused to back down. "I'm not doing this to hurt anyone," he said firmly. I need answers. Please try to understand." Sarah stormed out of the room, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. He knew she was right to be upset. What he was planning was unconventional, maybe even reckless, but he also knew he couldn't abandon the idea now. Something inside him urged him forward, whispering that this was the only way to find closure. Over the next few weeks, Michael navigated the bureaucratic maze required to authorize the exhumation. He visited city offices, signed forms, and met with officials who eyed him with varying degrees of skepticism. Some treated him with sympathy, sensing the depth of his grief. Others regarded him with thinly veiled suspicion, as though questioning his sanity. Through it all, Michael remained resolute, determined to see the process through. Finally, the day arrived. Early in the morning, Michael drove to the cemetery, his stomach churning with anxiety. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the landscape. Workers were already gathered around Ethan's grave, their tools laid out neatly beside them. A small tent had been erected nearby to shield the area from prying eyes, and a private viewing room had been prepared for the coffin once it was unearthed. As Michael approached, the cemetery director greeted him solemnly. "We'll proceed. Carefully, Mr. Thompson," he assured him. "This won't take long." Michael nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He stood back as the workers began digging, their shovels slicing into the earth with rhythmic precision. Each scoop of dirt felt like a punch to the gut, stirring up memories of the funeral 5 years earlier. He remembered standing here, watching as Ethan's casket was lowered into the ground, feeling utterly powerless to stop the tide of grief that threatened to drown him. Now, he was undoing that moment, reopening a wound he had hoped would heal. The digging continued for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably less than an hour. Eventually, the workers reached the casket, its surface still intact despite the passage of time. Carefully, they lifted it from the ground and placed it onto a wheeled cart, covering it with a tarp before wheeling it toward the viewing room. Michael followed silently, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside the viewing room, the coffin sat, on a metal gurney, bathed in harsh fluorescent light. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and antiseptic cleaner. Michael stared at the casket, his hands trembling. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever lay inside would either validate his actions or prove them to be a colossal mistake. Before proceeding, the cemetery director reminded Michael of the potential consequences. "Once we open this, there's no turning back," he said gently. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Michael swallowed hard, nodding again. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm sure." With that, the workers stepped forward, preparing to pry open the lid. Michael braced himself, unsure of what he might see or feel, when the contents of the coffin were revealed. His mind raced with possibilities: skeletal remains, decayed fabric, perhaps nothing more than dust. Whatever it was, he knew it would change him forever. As the lid creaked open, Michael leaned closer, holding his breath. For a brief moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint rustle of movement around him, the pounding of his own heartbeat. Then, slowly, the interior of the coffin came into view, and what he saw shocked him to his core. Instead of the grisly remnants he had anticipated, Michael was met with something entirely unexpected. Lying there, perfectly preserved, was Ethan, his face serene, his body untouched by decay. It was as though no time had passed since the day he was buried. His skin was smooth, his features peaceful, almost lifelike. Even his clothes appeared, unworn, free of any signs of deterioration. Michael stumbled backward, gasping for air. His legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed onto the floor, unable to tear his eyes away from the sight before him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Bodies don't stay preserved like this, not after 5 years underground. Yet here was Ethan, looking as if he were merely sleeping. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by what they were seeing. One of them muttered something about calling an expert, while another suggested documenting the scene for further investigation. But Michael barely heard them. All he could focus on was Ethan's face, so familiar yet so impossibly unchanged. In that moment, a flood of emotions overwhelmed him: shock, disbelief, awe, and something else he couldn't quite name. Was this some kind of miracle? A scientific Anomaly? Or was it proof that Ethan's spirit had indeed guided him here, fulfilling the message from his dream? Whatever the explanation, one thing was certain: Michael's journey was far from over. Odkrywayu. The sight of Ethan lying in the coffin, perfectly preserved after 5 years, left Michael paralyzed. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were telling him. It was as if time itself had stopped for Ethan, freezing him in that moment when he was laid to rest. The room seemed to spin around Michael, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering faintly, though perhaps it was just his vision blurring from shock. He sat on the cold floor, his breath shallow and uneven, unable to form a coherent thought. The workers who had opened the coffin exchanged nervous glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and unease. One of them muttered something about calling an expert, while another pulled out his phone to snap photos. "We should document this," one of them said hesitantly. This isn't normal." Michael barely registered their words. All he could focus on was Ethan's face, the same face he remembered so vividly from happier times. There were no signs of decay, no discoloration, no hint that 5 years had passed since Ethan's death. Even his clothes looked freshly pressed, untouched by the damp earth that had surrounded the coffin. It was as though Ethan had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. "Is this even possible?" Michael whispered hoarsely, more to himself than anyone else. His voice cracked under the weight of emotion, tears streaming down his cheeks unchecked. "How can this be real?" No one answered him. The workers busied themselves with making calls and jotting down notes, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The cemetery director, who had been standing quietly off to the side, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson," he began cautiously, "this is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like it before." Michael nodded absently, still staring at Ethan. Part of him wanted to reach out to touch his son's face and confirm that what he was seeing wasn't some cruel trick of the light. But another part of him held back, afraid that touching Ethan might shatter the fragile illusion, or worse, disturb whatever force had kept him preserved all these years. As the initial shock began to wear off, questions flooded Michael's mind. How had Ethan's body remained untouched? Was it due to advanced embalming techniques, some rare environmental factor? Or was there something more extraordinary at play? Something beyond the realm of science? The workers suggested bringing in forensic experts and scientists to examine the remains, hoping they could provide answers. Michael agreed reluctantly, knowing it was the logical next step, but dreading the intrusion. He felt protective of Ethan, as though allowing strangers to poke and prod him would somehow violate his peace. Still, he understood that they needed to figure out what had happened here. This wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about understanding the inexplicable. While waiting for the experts to arrive, Michael paced the small viewing room, his thoughts racing. He replayed the dream over and over again, recalling every detail of Ethan's appearance, every word he had spoken. "You need to open my coffin. It's important." Those words now carried a weight they hadn't before. What had Ethan been trying to show him? Why had his body been preserved in such an impossible state? Sarah arrived shortly after the exhumation team called her. She had been furious when Michael first told her about his plan, refusing to believe he would go through with it. But when she walked into the viewing room and saw Ethan for herself, her anger dissolved into stunned silence. Her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a sob as she collapsed into a chair beside Michael. This can't be real," she murmured, shaking her head. "It's not possible." "I know," Michael replied softly, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "But it is. Somehow." For a while they sat together in silence, holding each other as they gazed at Ethan's peaceful form. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The enormity of what they were witnessing was enough to bond them in shared disbelief and awe. When the forensic team finally arrived, they moved with careful precision, treating the scene with a mixture of reverence and scientific curiosity. They took samples of the soil from around the coffin, examined the casket for any unusual materials, and conducted preliminary tests on Ethan's body. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every angle of the phenomenon. Michael watched them work, feeling both grateful for their expertise and uneasy about their presence. One of the lead investigators, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Emily Carter, approached Michael during a break in their examination. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "we're doing everything we can to understand this, but I have to warn you, it may take some time. Whatever caused this level of preservation is highly unusual and will need to run extensive tests." Michael nodded, appreciating her candor. "I understand," he replied. "Just please let me know if you find anything." Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment, then added, "Have you considered, well, are there any religious or spiritual beliefs your family holds that might explain this?" The question caught Michael off guard. He glanced at Sarah, who shrugged, slightly equally unsure how to respond. "We're not particularly religious," Michael admitted, "but I did have a dream about Ethan. That's why I decided to open the coffin." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "A dream, you say?" "Yes," Michael continued, feeling self-conscious under her scrutiny. "He told me to open the coffin. Said it was important. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but now—" He trailed off, gesturing toward Ethan's body. "Now I don't know what to think." Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams can be powerful things, Mr. Thompson. Whether they're messages from the subconscious or something, more I can't say, but it's clear that something extraordinary led you here today. Whatever the explanation, I'll do my best to uncover it." As the day wore on, Michael and Sarah stayed close to the viewing room, unwilling to leave Ethan's side. They fielded calls from friends and family who had heard rumors of the bizarre discovery, though Michael asked everyone to keep the details private until they knew more. Word spread quickly nonetheless, drawing attention from local news outlets. Reporters began gathering outside the cemetery gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious event unfolding within. Despite the chaos, Michael found himself oddly calm. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Whatever secrets lay hidden in Ethan's coffin, he was determined to uncover them. If nothing else, he owed it to his son to see this through to the end. By evening, the forensic team had completed their initial assessment and carefully resealed the coffin, promising to return with more equipment and personnel the following day. As the workers wheeled the casket back to its resting place, Michael lingered behind, lingering near the grave. He knelt down, running his fingers over the fresh mound of dirt, his heart heavy yet strangely hopeful. "Thank you," he whispered softly, unsure whether he was speaking to Ethan, to fate, or to some higher power. "Whatever this means, I'll find out. I promise." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the cemetery bathed in the fading light of dusk. Though the mystery remained unsolved, one thing was certain: Michael's life and his understanding of loss, love, and the unknown would never be the same again.